The Galactic Council sent an observation fleet into human territory. Contact was lost within hours. The resolution passed by a margin of 11-2. 11 member species of the Galactic Cooperative voted in favor of deploying an observation fleet into what had been formally designated, 3 decades prior, as Restricted Exploration Zone 7, a volume of space spanning roughly 400 light-years that contained, according to survey drones and long-range spectroscopy, a single technologically active civilization. The 2 dissenting votes came from the Velhari Collective and the Sethran Accord, civilizations that had, in their own histories, encountered species they hadn't fully understood before making formal contact. Their objections were not philosophical. They were procedural. "We do not yet know enough," the Velhari delegate had said, her translation collar converting the layered harmonics of her speech into something the chamber's Babel systems could distribute. "Our passive survey data covers 61 years of observation. The species-designated Subject 7 has undergone 4 distinct industrial revolutions in that time. Their rate of technological acceleration is outside our modeling parameters." The motion passed anyway. The observation fleet was modest by cooperative standards, 12 vessels, none of them armed in the conventional sense, though all carried what the mission brief described as deterrent emitters capable of disrupting unshielded electronics at close range. The mission commander was a Theri admiral named Vasquet, a bureaucratic appointment if there ever was one. He had commanded 3 prior observation missions. All had concluded without incident. His primary science officer, a Yendri xenologist named Tezhari, had spent 9 years studying Subject 7 from safe distance. She had translated fragments of their broadcast signals. She had catalogued their warships, blunt, angular things that looked more like industrial equipment than military hardware. She had read their literature or what fragments of it could be decoded from electromagnetic leakage. She had, on 2 occasions, submitted formal concern reports to the Cooperative Science Division. Both had been filed and acknowledged. Neither had been acted upon. The fleet departed on a Tuesday, a time measurement that held no significance to anyone in the cooperative, but would later hold considerable significance to historians attempting to reconstruct the mission's timeline. What the cooperative did not fully appreciate, could not fully appreciate because their models had been built around species whose development curves followed recognizable patterns, was the nature of what Subject 7 had become. 61 years of observation had told them things. It had told them that Subject 7 was warlike, that they had fractured political structures, that they burned fossil fuels, then split atoms, then attempted to leave their gravity well with repurposed ballistic technology. What 61 years of observation had not told them was the speed of adaptation. In the cooperative's longest-standing civilizations, the gap between first industrialization and viable interstellar drive technology averaged somewhere between 800 and 1200 years. Even the fastest cases, the Sethran, who were considered anomalously rapid, had taken 400. Subject 7 had done it in 140. Not cleanly. Not without cost. Their first generation of FTL-capable vessels had a catastrophic failure rate. Nearly 30% of the early frames were lost to cascade drive failures, crew and all. They had grieved those losses publicly. They had built monuments. And then they had gone back to the drawing board with an almost disturbing intensity. The cooperative's most recent passive survey, compiled 18 months before the fleet departed, noted with academic interest that Subject 7 appeared to be extending their sensor network deeper into the surrounding void. The survey described this as territorial curiosity, likely exploratory. In retrospect, this was incorrect. Subject 7 had been listening. They knew something was out there. They had known for 11 years. The fleet entered REZ-7 on a vector that Tezhari had calculated would allow passive observation of the Subject 7 home system at a distance of approximately 12 light-hours, close enough for high-resolution instruments, far enough, theoretically, that any detection would be ambiguous. Theoretically. The first anomaly appeared 40 minutes after transit completion. "Commander," the signals officer said, "I'm reading active pulse emissions from 3 separate bearing vectors." Vasquet looked up from his command dais. "Scan resolution on the home system?" "Negative, sir. These emissions are not originating from the home system." The officer paused, rechecking his readouts with the careful deliberateness of someone who very much wanted to be wrong. "They are originating from local space. Within 100,000 kilometers." The bridge fell quiet. Tezhari was already pulling the emission signatures onto her station. She ran the frequency profiles against her translation corpus. It took 4 seconds. "Commander," she said. Her voice was flat. Not frightened exactly but very controlled. These are navigational transponder acknowledgement requests. They're using a protocol I've seen before. Subject: 7 Civilian Traffic Control uses it for inbound vessel identification. Vasquez stared at her. They're asking us, she said carefully, to identify ourselves. There was a long silence on the bridge. They knew we were coming, the tactical officer said. It wasn't a question. The fleet, to its credit, did not panic. Vasquez ordered communications silence, repositioned the formation into a tighter cluster, and authorized passive scanning on all arrays. What the arrays returned was not reassuring. The 3 emission sources were vessels. They were not small. They were not armed in any configuration the cooperative's weapons taxonomy recognized, which would later be interpreted as good news by some analysts and profoundly unsettling news by others. They were also moving. Slowly, with the unhurried precision of something that did not need to hurry. They're positioning themselves at our entry bearing, the navigator reported. At current velocity, they'll have a triangulated intercept solution in approximately 40 minutes. What kind of intercept? Vasquez asked. That depends on what they intend to do, sir. Tezhari pulled the visual spectrum data on the 3 vessels and expanded it on the main display. They were large, not warship large, not in the way the cooperative understood warships, but large in the way that infrastructure was large. The kind of large that meant they had been built to last. On their hulls, clearly visible in magnified imaging, were markings. The translation wasn't difficult. After 9 years of studying Subject 7's written languages, Tezhari could read the primary one with reasonable confidence. The markings said, United Earth Defense Command, Deep Space Observation Response. She read it twice. Then she pulled up her language files and checked the word she was translating as response. It was correct. Not patrol. Not survey. Not exploration. Response. Commander, she said. They didn't scramble these ships when we arrived. The name of the unit, Observation Response. That's a standing formation. This is a dedicated unit. They've had this ready for some time. Vasquez looked at the 3 vessels on the display. They were still moving. Patient and unhurried. How long? He asked. Tezhari checked the date on the hull markings. A commissioning stamp. She recognized the format. She did the math. 7 years, sir, she said. They've been waiting for us for at least 7 years. The cooperative fleet did not run. This would later be cited as the correct decision. The only decision, really, given that 3 vessels had placed themselves in a configuration that made any unilateral departure geometrically inconvenient without making it look like flight. Vasquez understood the calculus instantly. Running communicated fear. Fear communicated threat assessment. And an alien civilization capable of anticipating your arrival by 7 years was not one you wanted to suggest you feared. He authorized communication. The process was not simple. The cooperative fleet's linguistic suite had been built for analyzing intercepted signals, broadcast media, navigational chatter, encrypted military traffic that could be pattern analyzed over years of collection. It had not been built for real-time translation of a language spoken by a species that had never spoken to them before. Tezhari ran the initialization manually. It took 11 minutes, during which the 3 Subject 7 vessels continued their patient triangulation, neither approaching nor retreating. Just waiting. Subject 7 primary language is English, Tezhari reported. I have functional proficiency. Real-time translation will have a latency of approximately 3 seconds and an estimated error rate on idiom of around 8%. I recommend simple declarative sentences. No metaphor. Understood, Vasquez said. Open the channel. The first thing the cooperative said to humanity was, this vessel is of the Galactic Cooperative. We are here in observation. We mean no interference. The response came back in 11 seconds. Not 3, not the speed of someone fumbling for a translator, but 11 seconds of measured delay. As though they had drafted a reply and reviewed it before sending. Cooperative vessel, this is UEDC Resonance. We have been tracking your fleet since your transit point. You are currently inside Earth Defense Monitoring Zone 7. Please confirm crew count and vessel classification. Approach vector will remain as is until clearance is issued. Tezhari read it once. Then she looked at Vasquez. They have a name for this region, she said. They didn't adopt our designation. They have their own. That's not the relevant part, the tactical officer said. He was right. The relevant part was clearance is issued. As though 12 cooperative vessels requiring human permission to exist in this space was a completely unremarkable operational procedure. Vasquez gave them what they asked for. Crew count, 412. Vessel classification, science and survey, a designation the translation software rendered as something that Tezhari could only approximate as research ships. The tactical officer noted, quietly, that the deterrent emitters aboard were not technically classified as weapons under cooperative law, so their declaration was technically accurate. The response took 17 seconds this time. Cooperative Fleet classification received. One of your vessels, registry position 3 in your current formation, is broadcasting a low-frequency magnetic pulse consistent with an active deterrent system. Please confirm this is incidental rather than targeting active. The bridge went very quiet. They can read our emitter status, the tactical officer said. His voice was admirably level. From 100,000 kilometers, through passive hull contact, they read our emitter status. Tezhari said nothing. She was pulling up the technical files on Subject 7's known sensor capabilities, the ones the cooperative's passive surveys had documented. They described radar, LiDAR, multispectral imaging, basic gravimetric detection. Standard tier survey-grade technology. The files were clearly incomplete. Vasquez leaned forward. Tell them it's incidental. Confirm non-targeting. Incidental confirmed. System is safety active, not targeting active. We apologize for the ambiguity. This time the response came in 4 seconds. No issue. We'll log it as passive. Welcome to the monitoring zone, Cooperative Fleet. One of our liaison officers would like to speak with your commanding officer directly. Do you accept? Do you accept? The phrasing was interesting. Not a liaison officer will be speaking with you, not stand by for communication. An offer. A courtesy that assumed the answer might be no. They're being polite, Tezhari observed. Deliberately, I think. Accept, Vasquez said. The voice that came through the channel a minute later was unremarkable by any standard Tezhari could apply. A human male, speaking English at a moderate pace with none of the stress markers her database associated with confrontation. He sounded like someone who handled this kind of situation on a regular basis. Which she was beginning to understand he probably did. Commander Ket, my name is Colonel Adissa Okafor, UEDC Liaison Division. First, thank you for identifying yourselves and standing down your deterrent systems. That makes this easier for everyone. Second, I want to be clear that our current posture is non-hostile. We are not ordering you to leave, we are not threatening your vessels, and we don't intend to. Tezhari translated. Vasquez listened. Then he said, ask him how long they have known about us. She asked. The pause was slightly longer this time. 3-4 seconds. As though Okafor was choosing words. Cooperative Fleet, we detected your first survey drones approximately 31 years ago. We've had varying degrees of contact with your passive observation system since then. Our first confirmed intercept of a cooperative origin transmission was 22 years ago. We've had dedicated resources tracking your fleet's assembly and departure for approximately 14 months. Tezhari translated. Vasquez sat very still. Then he asked the question that had been in the room since they arrived. Why didn't you respond sooner? Why wait until we entered your zone? Another pause. Because you hadn't introduced yourselves yet, Okafor said. We figured if you wanted to talk you'd come closer eventually. We just wanted to make sure we were ready when you did. The conversation lasted 6 hours. In that time, Tezhari learned several things that would eventually appear in the Cooperative Science Division's amended Xenology reports, under a section heading that would later be described, in an internal review, as significantly understated. She learned that humanity had a unified defense command that had been operational for 43 years, assembled not because they expected attack, but because, as Okafor put it, we'd been watching our own history long enough to know that it was better to have something and not need it. She learned that the 3 vessels currently positioned around the cooperative fleet represented approximately 8% of the assets currently assigned to this monitoring zone. She learned that the term monitoring zone was not metaphorical. She learned that when Okafor said, we figured you'd come closer eventually, he meant that humanity had run models, actual predictive models with scenario branching and probability weights, on first contact protocols. He showed her the framework document, which was 140 pages long and had been revised 17 times. The cooperative's own first contact doctrine was 32 pages. It had not been revised since its original drafting. She also learned, when she asked directly, that the UEDC Liaison Division had 14 officers fluent in cooperative standard, a language humanity had no confirmed exposure to. She did not ask how they had learned it. She wasn't certain she was ready for that answer yet. At hour 7 of the initial contact session, Colonel Okafor suggested a recess. Not because the conversation had become difficult. It was, by most measures, progressing with a civility that surprised everyone on the cooperative side. He suggested it, he explained, because his crew had been on an extended readiness rotation since the fleet's transit and he wanted to give them a rest cycle. He also, with the frankness that Tezhari was beginning to recognize as characteristic rather than strategic, noted that the cooperative delegation probably had internal discussions they would benefit from having privately. "Take 12 hours, he said. "We'll be here." There was no ambiguity in those last 3 words. They would be here. Not "we will wait," not "we will stand by," not any phrasing that implied patience being extended. Just a simple, factual statement. "We will be here." The way someone describes furniture or weather. Vasquez ended the session and immediately convened a closed briefing with his senior officers and Tezhari. "The most important thing," Tezhari began before anyone else could speak, "is not what they've said. It's what they haven't." She had been organizing her notes during the conversation. In 9 years of studying subject 7, of studying humanity, she had learned to pay as much attention to the gaps in data as to the data itself. Silence was a language. Omission was a choice. "They have not told us how large their defense network is," she said. Okafor confirmed the 3 vessels represent 8% of monitoring zone assets. He did not tell us how many monitoring zones exist. When I tried to ask indirectly, he acknowledged the question, thanked me for my interest and continued to an adjacent topic. "Evasion?" the tactical officer asked. "Redirection," Tezhari said. "There's a difference. Evasion implies discomfort." This felt like professional courtesy. Like a host who has set out certain dishes for guests and is not yet inclined to show them the full pantry. "They have fluent speakers of our language," the communications officer said. 14, he said. "How?" "I don't know. That's troubling." "It should be," Tezhari agreed. "Our language is not broadcast publicly. It is used in internal cooperative communications. The only way they could have acquired it is through intercepted traffic. Which means they have been reading our transmissions for some time. Long enough for 14 individuals to reach fluency." She paused. "For context, I spent 9 years reaching functional proficiency in their primary language. I would not describe myself as fluent." The room processed that. "They know more about us than we know about them," Vasquez said. "Yes. Considerably more, I think. And they've been careful not to make that uncomfortable." The redirection when I asked about monitoring zones, the choice to phrase things as offers rather than directives. These are deliberate. They're calibrating the conversation to keep us from feeling like we're at a disadvantage. "Are we at a disadvantage?" the tactical officer asked. Tezhari considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. "We're in their space," she said. "We arrived in their space and they were already there, waiting, with a prepared doctrine and a dedicated response unit and 14 speakers of our language. They knew we were assembling this fleet 14 months ago. They've been tracking survey drones for 31 years. She folded her notes. "What do you think?" The 12-hour recess was spent in a way that Vasquez would later describe in his mission report as intensive reassessment. The tactical officer reviewed the weapons classifications. The deterrent emitters, which could disable unshielded electronics, and which had been detected and identified from 100,000 kilometers by passive hull contact, were not particularly impressive if the opposition could read your emitter status through your hull plating. He noted this in a carefully worded internal memo. He did not note it loudly. The communications officer spent 6 hours attempting to reconstruct, based on what Okafor had revealed, the likely timeline of human signals intelligence collection. She produced a preliminary estimate. She showed it to Tezhari. "This assumes minimum investment in dedicated collection," the officer said, "and minimum analyst hours." Tezhari looked at the numbers. "And at moderate investment?" "Double it. Roughly. So they've been reading us for 20+ years minimum." "The comfortable estimate, yes." Tezhari stared at the analysis for a long time. In her 9 years of studying humanity, she had focused heavily on their conflicts, their wars, which were numerous and documented in painful detail, their fractured political history, their long and ugly record of doing harm to each other and to the species that shared their world. She realized now, perhaps over-indexed on that record. She had underweight something else. Something that was visible in the same historical record if you looked for it. Humanity, when it perceived a threat, even a hypothetical long-range threat, even one that might never materialize, had an organizational instinct that the cooperative's models hadn't fully accounted for. They built things. Long timeline things. Institutions, doctrines, capabilities. They built them quietly and they staffed them with professionals and they kept them running year after year, against the possibility that one day those things would be needed. The UEDC had been operational for 43 years. The monitoring zone program, even at the minimum estimate, had been running for 31. This was not a civilization that had scrambled to respond. This was a civilization that had anticipated. "I want to ask him something directly," Tezhari said to Vasquez 40 minutes before the recess ended. "Off the formal record." Vasquez looked at her. "What do you want to ask?" "I want to ask him what they would have done," she said, "if we hadn't come peacefully." A long pause. "You think he'll tell you?" "I think he'll give me enough." Vasquez considered it. "Ask him," he said. "But listen carefully to how he says it, not just what he says." When the channel reopened, Tezhari asked the question before the formal session resumed. Okafor was quiet for 6 seconds, longer than usual. Then he said, "We would have continued to observe. If observation became untenable, we would have made our presence known. Loudly. That was all." Tezhari noted the word choice. Not we would have defended ourselves. Not we would have responded with force. Just loudly. She filed it carefully in her notes. When she briefed Vasquez afterward, she translated the word as precisely as she could. He didn't ask any follow-up questions. Neither did anyone else. On the third day of contact, the cooperative fleet was invited to move closer. Not to the home system. That was not on the table, and Okafor made clear it would not be on the table for some time, which was, he noted without apparent irony, entirely consistent with standard cooperative first contact doctrine. He had read the doctrine. He cited the relevant section. The invitation was to a waypoint, a position roughly 4 light hours from the home system, in a region of space that the UEDC charts designated as Approach Corridor 7 Alpha. The name implied there were other corridors. There were. The cooperative fleet transited under escort. 3 vessels became 7, 4 additional human ships that had apparently been positioned beyond initial sensor range, a detail that the tactical officer absorbed with professional composure and documented in his log with the phrase, "Previously undetected positioning, cuz under review." The waypoint contained a structure. Not a large structure by the standards of what the cooperative built. Roughly 3 kilometers end-to-end, angular, utilitarian in the way that working things were utilitarian. It extended no aesthetic consideration to its own appearance. It looked like it had been built to do a job. "What is that?" Vasquez asked. Okafor's voice came through the channel with a slight lag of distance. "Monitoring station. This one's been operational for 11 years. It covers about 40 light-years in every direction at passive range. More if we go active. It is crewed." "Yes." 312 personnel, rotating tour of 6 months. 312 people, alone in deep space for 6 months at a time, watching. Listening. Compiling data. Tezhari thought about the kind of institutional commitment that represented, not the technical investment but the human one. The willingness to send people out here year after year, to stare into the void on behalf of the species they'd left behind. She asked Okafor how many stations like this existed. He told her after a beat that the number was classified, but that she should assume coverage was not limited to this sector. She assumed and filed the assumption carefully. The science teams were given limited but real access to the station's exterior observation data, a carefully curated feed clearly prepared in advance, which told them a good deal about what the UEDC wanted them to know and implied, in its deliberate incompleteness, a fair amount about what they didn't. What they were shown: passive sensor architecture, spectral analysis libraries, a signals intelligence framework that was, by any honest measure, more sophisticated than what the cooperative's own long-range survey systems used. It was a different philosophy, where cooperative sensor doctrine prioritized reach, human sensor doctrine prioritized resolution. They had traded distance for depth. "This is not just monitoring us," the science officer said to Tezhari, reviewing the data. "The scope of this architecture, the filing systems, the archival depth, they've been monitoring everything. Every signal source in range." "For how long?" The science officer checked the archival timestamps. Then she checked them again. "The oldest entries in the accessible files," she said, "are dated 40 years ago." Tezhari looked at the timeline. 40 years ago, humanity had been a species with no functional FTL technology. They had been, by any external assessment, confined to a single star system. And 40 years ago, they had already begun building the institutional infrastructure to watch what was out there. Before they could reach it, they had begun watching it. They were preparing, Tezhari said. For what? For exactly this. She gestured at the display, at the fleet, at the whole improbable situation. For contact. For someone showing up. They couldn't have known. They didn't need to know, Tezhari said. They only needed to consider it possible. That afternoon, Tezhari requested a direct conversation with the station's chief analyst. Not Okafor, not a liaison officer, but the person responsible for the data collection they'd been shown. The request went up through channels and came back approved within 4 hours, which was faster than she expected. The analyst's name was Dr. Yui Tanaka. She was small, unhurried in the way that people with high confidence in their work were unhurried, and she met Tezhari's direct questions with direct answers, which was refreshing. Your archive goes back 40 years, Tezhari said. Your civilization's first functional FTL frame was commissioned 33 years ago, by our records. That means you were collecting this data 7 years before you could act on it? Yes, Tanaka said. Why? Tanaka tilted her head slightly. Because having the data before you need it is better than needing it before you have it. It was a simple answer. Obvious in retrospect. But Tezhari had spent 9 years studying humanity and she had not fully understood, until this moment, what that particular cultural instinct looked like when applied at institutional scale. It was not the instinct of a paranoid species. It was the instinct of a prepared one. Your surveys of this region, Tezhari said. Your passive observations of the cooperative. You were watching us before we were watching you. Tanaka didn't confirm or deny. She said, we were watching everything in range. Including us. Yes. And you chose not to make contact. We chose to wait until contact was offered, Tanaka said. There's a difference. That evening, Vasquez drafted his preliminary mission report. He was a methodical writer, careful, precise, trained in the understated register of cooperative administrative language. He had written 3 contact reports before this one. They had all concluded with assessments like, subjects showed limited technological sophistication, and contact parameters met without significant incident. This report was going to be different. He spent 2 hours on the opening assessment alone. He rewrote it 4 times. He was trying to describe, in the formal language of cooperative bureaucracy, something that formal bureaucratic language was genuinely ill-equipped to describe. He finally settled on, Subject 7 designated humanity, presents as a technologically active civilization in rapid maturation phase with significant preparedness doctrine investment. Their institutional readiness for external contact substantially exceeds current cooperative models. Recommend immediate and comprehensive reassessment of contact approach parameters, including review of all cooperative monitoring activities within Subject 7 sensor range. That last clause, within Subject 7 sensor range, he added after thinking about it for a long time. Because one of the things Tanaka's station had shown them in the curated data feed was the edge of human active sensor coverage. It was much farther out than the REZ7 boundary. It was, in fact, farther out than the position of the nearest cooperative relay station. He added a footnote, high probability exists that Subject 7 is already aware of cooperative infrastructure beyond this sector. Recommend diplomatic, not administrative, handling of all future communications. He read it back. Then he added one more line. This is not the contact scenario we modeled. On the 5th day, humanity showed them something they hadn't asked to see. It wasn't a threat display. Tezhari would spend considerable time later, making that argument in the halls of the Cooperative Science Division, to people who were inclined to interpret it differently. It wasn't a demonstration of force in the traditional sense. It was, she believed, an answer to a question that the cooperative fleet had been quietly asking since they arrived. The question that sat underneath every exchange, every calibrated courtesy, every carefully worded non-answer about the extent of human monitoring coverage. The question was simple. How strong are you? It began with a technical demonstration. Okafor, during the day's first formal session, mentioned, conversationally, almost as an aside, that the UEDC had a training exercise scheduled in a nearby system that the fleet might find academically interesting, if they cared to observe from safe distance. He was careful to frame it as optional. He was also careful to frame it as training, which was a word that could mean many things. Vasquez agreed and the fleet repositioned. What they observed, at a distance of roughly 2 light hours, was a coordinated multi-vessel exercise that lasted 8 hours. Tezhari watched it carefully and took extensive notes. She noted the reaction times, how quickly the formations shifted from transit configuration to combat spread geometry. She noted the communication discipline, how rarely the vessels needed to exchange explicit instructions, which implied either very good automation or very good training. She noted the layering of the formations, how the smaller, faster vessels established outer coverage before the larger ones completed their own positioning, suggesting a doctrine that prioritized buffer distance over mass concentration. She noted, with particular care, the drive signatures. The cooperative's passive analysis of Subject 7's propulsion technology, compiled from 30 years of sensor data, had classified their drives as Generation 2 FTL. Fast, reasonably efficient, with limitations on sustainable output duration. The drive signatures she was seeing now were not consistent with that classification. She ran the profiles 3 times, cross-referencing against every database entry she had. The closest match was a Generation 3 configuration, a category the cooperative's own engineering branches had prototypes of but had not yet deployed at fleet scale. "They've upgraded," she said to the science officer. Since our survey estimates." "How recently?" "I don't know. Recent enough that our data didn't catch it. Which means in the last 18 months, or they concealed it from our sensors actively." The science officer considered both options. "I'm not sure which one concerns me more," she said. After the exercise, Okafor opened a private channel, just him and Vasquez, with Tezhari translating. "I wanted to give you some context for what you just saw," he said. "Please," Vasquez said. "What we just ran was a standard fleet response certification exercise. We do them on a 16-week rotation. The vessels you were watching are a patrol element, not a specialized unit, not an elite designation, just a standard patrol element assigned to this sector. What you saw is what UEDC patrol elements do." "Boss, I mention this because I think context matters. We're not trying to intimidate your fleet. We're just going about our normal operations. I wanted you to know that what you saw is the baseline, not the exception." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "How many patrol elements like this exist?" "That's classified information. But I'd invite you to think about the math. We have 43 years of institutional development, a single unified command structure across a species of 9 billion, and a well-documented historical tendency to invest heavily in things we consider strategic priorities." He said it without any inflection of pride. Just information delivered clearly. "We're not a small-scale operation," he added. "I want you to have an accurate picture." Tezhari, that evening, wrote the section of her personal log that she was already beginning to think of as the hardest one to write. She had spent 9 years studying humanity. She had come into this mission with the considered professional opinion that humanity was a dangerous species in a recoverable condition. Violent by historical record, yes, but showing clear long-term trends toward consolidation and institutional stability. She had argued in her concern reports that the cooperative was moving too fast toward contact. She had not argued what she was now beginning to think. What she was beginning to think was that the cooperative's models had not just underestimated humanity's pace. They had mischaracterized humanity's nature. The cooperative's first contact models were built around a fundamental assumption, that technological development was a reliable proxy for institutional and doctrinal maturity. A species that had just achieved FTL was, by definition, early in its maturation. They would be curious, perhaps reckless, possibly dangerous in the way that young civilizations were dangerous, through inexperience rather than intent. They would need to be managed carefully. What Tezhari was seeing was a species that had achieved FTL 140 years after first industrialization, 30 years ago from the outside, and had, in those 30 years, built a unified defense command, an extensive monitoring infrastructure, a contact response doctrine, and a fleet that ran 16-week certification rotations as a baseline standard. 30 years. She thought about what the cooperative had been doing 30 years after its own member species had achieved interstellar travel. The answer, which she knew from historical records, was arguing about trade routes. "They compressed everything," she wrote. Their history of conflict, which we used as a risk assessment metric, was also a learning curriculum. They had more wars than any comparable civilization in our records. They also learned more per war. By the time they reached interstellar capability, they had already worked out most of the organizational problems that other species spend centuries solving. She paused, looking at what she'd written. Then she added, "We were watching them develop. They were watching us watch them. And while we were studying their weaknesses, they were quietly addressing them." On the 8th day, Vasquez made a decision that was either the most professionally courageous or professionally reckless thing he had done in his career, depending on which of his senior officers you asked. He requested a face-to-face meeting. Not over channel, not the translation-lagged, signal-mediated exchange that had governed the first week of contact. He requested a physical meeting aboard a neutral vessel, with delegations from both sides, conducted in real time. Okafor's response took longer than usual. Nearly an hour. When it came, it was simple: "We can do that. We'll provide the venue." The venue was a human vessel, one of the original 3 that had been waiting when the fleet arrived. The resonance itself. Okafor's ship. This was deliberate. Tezhari understood that immediately and understood why. The meeting being on a human vessel placed the cooperative delegation in the position of guests rather than hosts, which carried an implicit message about whose space this was and who held the navigational and tactical advantages in any conceivable scenario where the meeting went badly. It was not a threatening message. It was an accurate one. She briefed Vasquez on this interpretation. He told her he had already arrived at the same conclusion independently. "Should we propose a neutral location?" the tactical officer asked. "There is no neutral location," Vasquez said. "We are in their monitoring zone. Every location within practical transit distance is their location. Accepting their venue is honest. Arguing for neutrality we cannot actually guarantee is not." The tactical officer had no response to that. The resonance was not what Tezhari expected. She had formed an image, over 9 years, of what human military vessels looked like from the outside. Angular, industrial, built to working tolerances rather than aesthetic ones. The exterior of the resonance matched that image. The interior did not. It was not luxurious. It was not designed to impress. But it was designed with a kind of functional intentionality that surprised her. Spaces that were clearly meant to be habitable for extended periods, not merely survivable. Art on the corridor walls. Not decorative art, but work. Photographs, drawings, printed text in frames. Personal. Human. Okafor met them at the docking interface with a small delegation of 4. Himself, Tanaka, a woman he introduced as Fleet Admiral Reyes, and a man identified simply as a legal counsel. Legal counsel. At a first contact meeting. Tezhari noted the detail without comment. The meeting lasted 5 hours. The first 2 were substantive. A careful, structured exchange of what each side was willing to say formally. The cooperative laid out its mission parameters, its intentions, its governance structure. The UEDC representatives listened, asked precise questions, and offered equally precise responses about human governance structure, defense posture, and what they described as basic strategic interests. It was the phrase strategic interests that generated the most significant exchange. Tezhari translated it for Vasquez as priorities they are committed to defending. He asked her to ask Admiral Reyes what specifically those interests were. Reyes had a face that gave very little away. She had the stillness of someone who had sat in difficult rooms for many years and learned not to react to things before she had finished thinking about them. "Our strategic interests," she said, "are the security of human space, the welfare of our people, and a stable relationship with any civilization capable of reaching our territory." In that order. Tezhari translated. Vasquez absorbed it. "She said it in that order deliberately," Tezhari murmured, "just for him." "I know," he said. In the 3rd hour the tone shifted. Not toward hostility, toward honesty, which was sometimes harder. It was Reyes who moved it there. She set down the document she'd been referencing and looked at Vasquez directly, or as directly as possible, given the physical differences and the slight awkwardness of sustained cross-species eye contact. "I want to say something off the formal record," she said. Okafor nodded. Tanaka made a small note. The legal counsel looked as though he was already composing an annotation. "Your cooperative sent a fleet into our monitoring zone," Reyes said. "That fleet has been here for 8 days. In that time you've been professional, honest and careful. We appreciate that. It makes this easier. A beat. But I want to be direct about something that I think we've been talking around." Vasquez said nothing, which was his way of inviting her to continue. "You did not know what you were flying into," she said. "Not fully. Your survey data was out of date, your doctrine assumptions were based on models we do not fit, and your deterrent systems were, I think you now understand, not as discrete as your planning assumed." She said this without judgment. "We are not holding any of that against you. What I want you to take back to your cooperative is a clear and accurate picture of what you encountered here so that the next conversation, the bigger one, the formal one, the one that shapes what our relationship looks like for the next 100 years, starts from an honest baseline." Tezhari translated. Vasquez looked at Reyes for a long moment. "What does that picture look like?" he asked. "It looks like this," Reyes said. "We are a young civilization by your standards. We know that. We have been watching you for a long time and we understand that what we are, from the outside, looks like a species that is still finding its footing. That assessment is not wrong. But it is incomplete. She folded her hands on the table. What we are, specifically, is a species that has a long history of being caught unprepared and a very strong institutional commitment to making sure that doesn't happen again. We are not trying to expand into your space. We are not hostile to the cooperative. We are willing to build a stable and productive relationship with any civilization that approaches us honestly. Pause. But we are not a species you can manage. We are a species you will need to negotiate with. There is a difference and it matters, and I want you to go back knowing that we know the difference. After the meeting, on the transit back to the cooperative fleet, Tezhari reviewed her notes for a long time. She thought about the report she would write. She thought about the Velhari delegate's objection months ago in the cooperative chamber, "We do not yet know enough," and the 11 votes that had overridden it. She thought about Rhea's phrase, "We are not a species you can manage." It was not a threat. It was a boundary. The difference was important, and Reyes had been right that it mattered. She also thought about something Tanaka had said during the station visit, when Tezhari had asked what humanity's long-term objectives in space were. "The same things everyone wants, I imagine," Tanaka had said. "Security, resources, contact with people worth knowing, a future that our children can build on. Worth knowing." That was the phrase Tezhari kept returning to. Not contact with civilizations we can benefit from, not contact with civilizations we can learn from, not even the vaguely transactional language that most first contact frameworks used. Worth knowing. She wrote it down because she intended to quote it exactly when she got home. The cooperative fleet departed on the 14th day. The departure was, by formal measure, amicable. An exchange of documentation, a communication protocol established for future contact, an open invitation, extended by Okafor on behalf of the UEDC, for a formal diplomatic delegation to visit within the next 2 standard years. Not the home system, not yet, but a waypoint meeting of the kind that the fleet had just experienced. A next step. Vasquez accepted on behalf of the cooperative, understanding that his authority to do so was technically limited but that the alternative, declining or hedging, communicated something he wasn't prepared to communicate. The 7 escort vessels accompanied the fleet to the transit boundary. There was no ceremony, no dramatic farewell. Just a final channel exchange, clean and professional, and then the fleet transited and they were gone. The first thing Vasquez said once they were clear was, "Get me a full after-action on those escort positioning logs. I want to know when they stop tracking us." The tactical officer ran the analysis and came back 40 minutes later. "Sir," he said, "our passive sensors stopped detecting the escort vessels approximately 3 minutes before we transited. They were running some kind of masking protocol during the final approach." "They were masking from us?" Vasquez asked. "No, sir. From outside. They were masking from an external bearing." The officer paused. "From the direction of deep space. Away from both of us." Vasquez looked at that information for a long time. "They have someone else to worry about," he said quietly. "Besides us." "That's what it looks like, sir." He filed it in the report and did not speculate further. Some things were better understood slowly. The mission report reached the Cooperative Science Division 22 days later. It was 111 pages long, not counting appendices. The appendices were another 84 pages. The division director read it in a single sitting, which was unusual. He was a Yendri, as Tezhari was, old enough to have been in the cooperative's administrative structure when the first survey drones had been dispatched to REZ 7 decades before. He remembered the initial debates. He remembered the confident models. He remembered the language used: primitive acceleration curve, manageable contact window, low strategic significance. He read Teshari's report with the specific kind of quiet that settles over a person who is discovering that something they considered settled is not settled at all. When he finished, he called the Velhari delegate. She picked up immediately. She had clearly been waiting. "You read it?" she said. "Yes." "Your thought?" He was quiet for a moment. "My thought is that we should be grateful they're reasonable," he said. "And that we should understand why they're reasonable the way we understand a technical spec, not the way we understand a personality trait." "What do you mean?" "I mean that they're reasonable because reasonableness serves their interests. They have sensor coverage we don't fully understand, fleet capability we underestimated, and a monitoring doctrine they've been running for 31 years. They don't need to be aggressive. They've already won the preparedness competition." He paused. "They're being patient with us because they can afford to be patient." The Velhari delegate was quiet. "That is," she said finally, "exactly what I was trying to say in the chamber." "I know," he said. "I voted against you. I remember." Teshari's personal addendum to the report, technically optional, technically unofficial, but included by Vasquez because he considered it the most important part, was 4 pages long. She had written it over 3 days, discarding drafts, trying to find language that was precise without being alarmist and honest without being political. She was a scientist. She dealt in observations. She would record what she observed and let the institutions do what they chose with it. What she observed, she wrote, was a civilization that had been shaped by its own worst history into something that did not look, from the outside, like what it was. Humanity looked like a species in recovery, and in some ways it was. But recovery, applied consistently and institutionally over decades, produces something different from the wounded thing it started as. It produces competence. Not the competence of a species that had never been harmed, which was a kind of untested optimism. The competence of a species that had been harmed badly, repeatedly, and had rebuilt each time with specific improvements, specific institutional memories of what failure looked like and how to prevent it. The cooperative, she wrote, has never had a civilization-scale trauma. Our history is long but largely stable. We have never had to rebuild a unified defense command from the wreckage of a fractured political order. We have never had to fund a 30-year monitoring program while simultaneously recovering from war. We have never had to compress 4 centuries of organizational development into one. Humanity has done all of these things. That is not admirable in the abstract. It is significant in the specific. The final section of her addendum addressed something that none of the formal documentation covered, a conversation she'd had privately with Okafor in the last hour before the fleet departed. She had asked him what, from his side, the contact had meant. Not tactically, not strategically. Personally. He had thought about it for a while. Honestly, he said. Relief. We've been watching your survey drones for 30 years. We've been listening to your communications, learning your languages, trying to figure out what kind of people you are. And you know what the hardest part of that is? She asked. Not knowing if you'd be people we could work with. Because we couldn't ask. We could just watch. And watching a civilization from the outside, you see everything. The politics, the disagreements, the moments where they got it wrong. It's easy to build an unflattering picture. He paused. But you flew into our space, you identified yourselves, you were honest even when honesty was uncomfortable. You sent scientists and diplomats, not soldiers. And when we showed you things that should have been alarming, you processed them and stayed at the table. He looked at her directly. That's not nothing, he said. That tells us who you are. Not the documents, not the mission brief. That tells us. Tezhari quoted that exchange in full, with minimal commentary. She thought it said something important about what contact was actually for. Not the accumulation of strategic intelligence, not the establishment of territorial boundaries, not even the formal protocols of civilization-to-civilization recognition. Contact was, at its deepest level, the moment 2 species looked at each other and decided whether the other was worth knowing. They had passed, she believed. Both of them. Whether the cooperative's governing bodies would have the wisdom to act on that, to approach humanity as a partner in the making rather than a variable to be managed, was outside her ability to predict. But she had met a species that had been waiting, carefully and without complaint, for someone to come close enough to talk to. A species that had prepared for the worst and extended the best they had anyway. A species that had sent a legal counsel to a first contact meeting, not because they expected a contract but because they understood that civilization was built on agreed terms, and they had wanted to get it right from the first moment. She closed her addendum with a single sentence. We were not ready for them. With appropriate urgency we can begin to be. The Galactic Cooperative opened formal diplomatic negotiations with the United Earth Defense Command 2 years later, at the waypoint designated Approach Corridor 7 Alpha. The cooperative sent a delegation of 23, including their most experienced contact specialists and 3 members of the science division. The human delegation was 31 people. One of them was a legal counsel. The same one.